Number 9. Rachel Hoffman. During a routine traffic stop in Tallahassee, Florida in 2007, a new college graduate named Rachel Hoffman was caught with over 5 ounces, 142 grams of cannabis, and a handful of ecstasy pills. To avoid prison, she agreed to work off the charges by acting as a police informant against others in the drug scene. As part of the operation, Hoffman was tasked with trying to buy a large amount of ecstasy and cocaine and 2 handguns with $13,000 cash. It was an out-of-character buy for the young woman, but the authorities asked her to do it anyway. Hoffman went to the cellar with 2 undercover police officers that were tasked with acting as her security. The suspects changed the location last minute, and the undercovers tried warning her not to follow them, but she didn't get their message thanks to technical difficulties. So she went with the suspects in a stolen car, and her handlers lost track of her. Just a few minutes later, one of the suspects shot her execution style with one of the guns she was trying to buy. The suspects, Daniello R. Bradshaw and Andrea Jabbar Green, were soon convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But the Tallahassee Police Department also came under fire for their botched sting operation. Many blamed them for the avoidable loss of life just as much as the killers themselves. Consequently, new legislation called Rachel's Law now requires law enforcement agencies in Florida to provide special training to officers working with confidential informants. Number 8. Christopher Dean. In October 2016, members of Atlanta's gangster Disciple street gang found out that 33-year-old Christopher Dean acted as a police informant in his past. Feeling betrayed and threatened, 5 gang members lured him to a home in Atlanta for what he thought was going to be a drug sale. When he got there, they tortured him for at least an hour, beating him severely with a crowbar and a 2x4 to show that being a snitch wasn't tolerated. The gang then shot Dean twice in the back of the head, before calling over 2 other members who were supposed to clean up the crime scene and dispose of the victim's body. After witnessing the horrifying condition of Dean's remains, the pair stuffed him into the trunk of a car and left it parked outside a local gas station, instead of getting rid of it the way they were supposed to. Police discovered Dean's body in the trunk and ultimately linked all 7 suspects to the murder. At least 5 of the gang members were convicted of the killing and sentenced to life in prison without parole, including Christopher Lockett, Xavier Gibson, Cortez Clark, Joshua Rooks, and Jasper Green. Number 7. Heidi Allen. 18-year-old Heidi Allen was working as a convenience store clerk in New Haven, New York, when she suddenly vanished without a trace on Easter morning in 1994. Authorities believe Heidi was kidnapped and that she's most likely dead, but her body was never recovered, and her fate has stayed a mystery. To this day, the Oswego County Sheriff's Department and the FBI consider her a missing person. Among the many questions surrounding Heidi's disappearance is whether she was a confidential informant when she went missing. Despite unknown details, prosecutors concluded that a man named Gary Thibodeau, the last person to see Heidi alive, was responsible for whatever happened to her. He was convicted of the alleged crime in 1995, and yet the case has remained under investigation ever since. Law enforcement claim the case is open because they want to find Heidi's body, not because they have any doubt on who's responsible. But Thibodeau maintained his innocence until his death in 2018. In 2015, his lawyer speculated that Heidi's disappearance had something to do with her being a drug informant. They even claimed that the sheriff's refusal to hand over documents on Heidi's status affected their ability to properly defend Thibodeau. Sadly, many details about the case remain shrouded in mystery, including things authorities could reveal if they were willing to do so. Whether Heidi was a drug informant and whether or not it contributed to her disappearance is still unclear. Number 6. Informant number 913. Guillermo Eduardo Ramirez Pero, or Informant number 913, was a Mexican drug informant for American authorities back in the year 2000. Law enforcement immediately noticed that Guillermo, or Lalo, was different from their typical informant. Lalo was well-dressed, respectful, and eagerly gave up information without hesitation, and he wasn't looking to cut a deal either, since he wasn't in legal trouble. Former U.S. Immigration and Customs agent Raul Bencomo later told National Public Radio that the intel the informant provided came from the higher ranks of the cartel that he worked for. The information was so reliable that he helped authorities take down a corrupt customs agent and an international cigarette smuggling ring. In fact, according to Bencomo, the feds couldn't keep up with the amount of reports Lalo submitted. Authorities learned the hard way that Guillermo was just as much a participant in illegal activity as he was an informant. Until then, they didn't realize that he was playing both sides of the coin, and they would soon realize that drug smuggling was on the milder end of Lalo's illegal activities. Lalo accompanied his boss, a high-ranking drug kingpin, and several others on an 8-month brutal kidnapping, torture, and killing spree. His superiors on the legal side of things kept him on their payroll even though his participation in crimes was unacceptable under official protocol. Former DEA Special Agent Phil Jordan accused several ICE agents of giving Lalo a license to kill and for failing to share their intel with Mexican authorities, which they should have done in the first place. He said that every rule and regulation revolving around informants was broken with Lalo. For 6 years after the murders, ICE officials refused to speak on the case at all. At least a dozen bodies were found at the location where Lalo's worst crimes were committed, nicknamed the House of Death. U.S. authorities insisted it was an isolated incident, but Mexican officials had a hard time looking past the ordeal and the broken trust that came with it. Number 5. Andrew SADEK. While going to college in North Dakota in 2013, Andrew SADEK was arrested on felony charges for selling marijuana. He faced years in prison, so he agreed to be a confidential informant for the Southeast Multi-County Agency Narcotics Task Force, or SEMCA, in exchange for getting his charges dropped. SADEK's work as an informant started with several controlled buys from dealers around campus, but he disappeared suddenly one day in 2014, and nobody knew what happened to him until 2 months later, when his body was found in Minnesota's Red River with a gunshot wound to the head. Police concluded that SADEK must have taken his own life to escape his obligations as an informant, but the young man's family believes he was likely murdered. He didn't leave behind a goodbye or suicide note, and his backpack was filled with rocks, which seemed to his loved ones like he was met with foul play. State authorities investigated SADEK's suspicious death at his mother's request, but ruled that there was nothing strange about it. But the family was successful in their campaign to pass Andrew's Law, which ended mandatory drug sentencing and increased the amount of drugs a suspect had to be caught with in order to be charged under law with dealing. They also introduced new provisions meant to protect confidential informants. Number 4. Susan Cooper. After being arrested on federal drug charges in 2016, Susan Cooper from Arkansas agreed to become an informant to reduce her legal consequences. She provided investigators with information that led them to a meth dealer named Samuel Sherman, who also agreed to cooperate with police. But the information he gave wasn't enough to help his case, and he still faced a significant amount of time behind bars. Angry about the mess he was caught up in and at the person he thought got him into it, Sherman called a friend, Donald Bill Smith, who was also a meth dealer and had a history of selling drugs, to Susan's sister-in-law, Rachel Cooper. Sherman, Smith, and Rachel Cooper worked together to make a deal with Susan, who thought she was going to trade some hydrocodone pills for meth. Rachel picked Susan up and drove her to the drug deal site. When they got there, Smith came out and shot Susan multiple times. He pulled her out of the car as Rachel panicked and sped off, seemingly unaware that the plan all along had been to murder the girl. Her body remained missing until 18 months later, when another informant told detectives that Smith had forced them to help bury Susan in a secluded pasture. Smith and Sherman were convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy to cause witness tampering resulting in death. They were each given life in federal prison. Number 3. Valentin BROEKSMIT. 46-year-old Valentin BROEKSMIT was a musician by day and an informant by night. And he wasn't an ordinary snitch either. He had some seriously high-ranking intel, earning him favor among the United States top intelligence authorities. In early 2021, he turned over a stash of secret documents about Deutsche Bank to the FBI. The files were reportedly about the financial institution's money laundering ties with Russia and the activities of former US President Donald Trump. BROEKSMIT reportedly accessed the info using email passwords belonging to his late stepfather, a former Deutsche Bank executive who committed suicide in 2014. The elder BROEKSMIT left behind a note detailing how he had failed to cover up fraud on the bank's behalf. New York Times business investigations editor David Enrich later described the younger BROEKSMIT as a routine drug abuser who desperately wanted to be the center of attention and feel like he mattered, which was perhaps what motivated him to become an informant in the first place. In 2020, not long after he submitted the damning documents, BROEKSMIT's car was found abandoned in Los Angeles. Based on its contents, it seemed as if he was homeless, but BROEKSMIT himself was nowhere to be found. The man's body was discovered dead a year later inside a local high school. Authorities said there were no signs of foul play, but they offered few details regarding the mysterious circumstances of his death, leaving the rest of the world wondering whether the troubled musician's activities as an informant contributed to his downfall. Number 2. David Foley. While working as a confidential informant for the Rockford Police Department in Winnebago County, Illinois back in 2020, David Foley purchased cocaine from 25-year-old Preston Scott. Months later, he was found dead next to his car with several gunshot wounds. It wasn't long before investigators focused their sights on Scott, who was probably motivated to kill Foley thanks to the victim's status as an informant. After an investigation, Scott was charged in connection to 7 different murders, including Foley. He had an outstanding warrant in a drug case when authorities apprehended him for David's murder, and he was found guilty in late 2022. In light of the senseless tragedy, Rockford Police Chief Dan O'Shea reminded the public that the agency wasn't about to back down, but that it instead would step up its efforts to hold suspects responsible for selling illegal drugs and contraband. According to the most recent update, Scott was still awaiting sentencing. He faces up to 85 years in prison for the murder charge, as well as 14 years for being a felon in unlawful possession of a weapon. Number 1. John Dowry Jr. After he was arrested in 2004 on several gun and drug charges in East Baltimore, 38-year-old John Dowry Jr. faced over a decade behind bars. To avoid a lengthy prison sentence, he decided to become an informant in a federal murder case. The feds eventually lightened up on Dowry's restrictions. They excused him from jail time and let him go to rehab instead. He was also allowed to continue working. But Dowry's fresh start was interrupted when he came home from his factory job in 2005. He was waiting outside for his girlfriend to unlock the door of their apartment when 2 men approached him from behind and shot him. Dowry ran, but the gunmen continued firing and landed 6 shots on him. He eventually got inside his home and collapsed onto the floor. Miraculously, surgeons were able to save Dowry's life, but the near-death experience made him realize that people knew he was a snitch and that his life was in grave danger, so he left the area and maintained a low profile until Thanksgiving 2006, when he returned to East Baltimore to spend the holidays with his family. During the celebration, Dowry stopped at a convenience store. He was in there for just a few minutes before he was shot dead. After finally persuading witnesses to talk, authorities charged drug traffickers Melvin Gilbert and Darren Good with the man's murder. They were both sentenced to life without parole. Thanks for watching. Would you rather live knowing that you didn't turn in a dangerous criminal, or become an informant at the cost of your own safety? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.